Good evening, and thanks for joining our latest club support legal webinar. Tonight we're looking at good club governance, what it is, why it's important, and how you can achieve it. We have a diverse audience this evening, and we're joined by a range of different sized clubs. Some clubs will have paid staff and paid secretarial functions, for example, and others will be entirely volunteer-led. But regardless of your club's own size, we've tried to make the content applicable to all, and we'll illustrate the points we discuss with practical examples to give the content as much context as we possibly can. So let me start by introducing your hosts. My name's Tom Barnard, and I'm a Senior Associate in Erwin Mitchell's Dispute Resolution team. As part of my work, I advise sports organisations on issues related to governance. I also advise in relation to commercial disputes that include claims against directors and trustees. I also, for my sins, coach an under-9s rugby team, so I have some practical experience of the day-to-day organisation of club sport. Tina Webster is a partner in our real estate development team. Tina regularly advises institutions in all sectors on governance, including in relation to the need for organisations to be properly governed when it comes to financing transactions with external finance providers. In addition, Tina has been a college governor and has sat on the board of sailing clubs. Currently, Tina's on the board of the Chichester Festival Theatre and is about to join the board of another sailing club. Tina therefore has first-hand practical experience of the issues we're going to cover. James Pavey is a partner at Erwin Mitchell. James has a wide-ranging property, trust, planning and environmental disputes practice. He's also a charity trustee and an officer of the British Association of the Order of Malta and of the Order of Malta Volunteers. James's role as an officer, his title is actually a hospitaller, is to have oversight of all of the Order of Malta's British works, including organising pilgrimages and organising soup kitchens from London to St Andrews. From England Rugby, we're joined by Alex Thompson and Dave Stubley. Alex is the volunteer manager for learning and development, and Dave is National Club Development Manager. Between them, Alex and Dave have worked for the RFU for more than 25 years, and day to day they work with clubs on development and governance issues. They're going to share some insights and practical examples of the problems poor governance can create, and Dave is going to host the Q&A at the end of tonight's session. So on the Q&A, a few practicalities. Please get involved tonight by asking questions in the Q&A chat box. All that we ask is that you include your name and your club when submitting a question, so that if we don't have time to deal with it this evening, we can do so in the days that follow. Alex and Dave will be monitoring and answering questions as we go through the session, and we've also had some questions in advance, so thank you to those of you that have submitted them. What we've done is we've tried to tailor the content so that it actually responds to the questions that we've had. Lastly, we are recording the session and a playback will be made available to you together with the slides in the next few days. We'll also be posting a short feedback survey for the session, and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete that today or tomorrow. So what is it we're going to look at? Well, we're going to look at governance and what it is, why good governance is important. We're going to look at some England Rugby case studies, and then we'll look at the sporting framework for good governance, followed by the legal structures available to rugby clubs, the duties owed by trustees and directors, and then, as I mentioned, we'll finish with a Q&A session. So we've got an awful lot to get through, and so let me hand on to Tina, who will tell us what good governance is and then why it's important. Tina?
Thank you very much, Tom, and good evening, everybody. I just wanted to start off by saying what is governance, and it's a bit like an elephant. It's really difficult to describe, but you know what it is. Generally, governance covers and embraces a whole range of issues. It's the process of running your club, it's the way you make decisions, and it's to ensure you make your club fully accountable. So to have good governance, it's all about having the right structure, having the right people and leadership, embracing and engaging policies and procedures. But it goes beyond that. It's all about club values, what you stand for, what you're there for, your openness, your accountability. And then on top of it, it's very important that you constantly monitor your governance, keep it up to date, not only to keep up to date with legislation, but to keep up to date with your own changing circumstances. It may be that you're thinking of going into a merger, or you're thinking of running a joint venture or a new, perhaps a trading venture. And in all cases, you've got to refer back to your governance and make those decisions in accordance with good governance. So I'd like to move on to thinking about why it is important on the next slide, please. It's fairly obvious as to why governance is important, but we often find, and with very good reason, that volunteer clubs start with people with very good intentions. They're all run by amateurs. People give up their own time with the best of intentions. The club grows, and the governance doesn't really keep pace with the size and the range of activities that the club's involved with. So having a good governance structure in place means that your club can really be more effective. You can concentrate on the things that are important to the club. It also secures your future. If you've got a good governance in place, you know that you're sustainable. You can keep track of what you're doing. Very important for your reputation. You certainly don't want anything which harms your reputation, but also you need a good reputation to attract new members. Many of the Sport England and other grant-making organisations will insist on looking at your governance to ensure that it's credible and meets their standards. Managing risk is very important. It protects your members and volunteers, and obviously helps you avoid financial problems. And being lawyers, we have to say it also helps you avoid any claims, both from within the club and outside the club. So it's fairly obvious that if you have weak governance, you're really exposing yourself to problems in the future. And at this point, I'm just going to hand over to James, who's had some real live experience of good and bad governance outside the sporting arena, but still very relevant to what we're talking about today. James.
Well, thank you, Tina, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to echo some of the points which Tina has made without repeating them. But I think the reputational point is very, very important in an increasingly transparent world, and I think one only has to think about safeguarding. And as Tom said earlier on, I have a role in a Catholic charity, and you will appreciate, I'm sure, that's in that context, as the lead safeguarding trustee, it's something I feel very, very keenly. It's an important point. It's illegal. There are legal obligations, there are moral obligations, but there are also big reputational issues that go with getting that right, and indeed with getting that wrong. I think it's also, I've had quite a lot of experience over 20 years in practice of dealing with members' organisations. I used to act, sort of 10, 15 years ago, before the legislation came in, which stopped it in effect, actually for a lot of hunts, as members' clubs involved in sporting activities, and there actually I saw quite frequently the effects actually of a sort of a badly written constitution on the back of an envelope. And this is Tina's point about actually the organisation growing more quickly than actually the rules and the envelope for actually sort of sorting out the disputes and where do you go to find the written rules that say you do this if something happens, or if you need to make a decision properly, this is the procedure you follow. And actually it emphasised to me that if you've got a good written constitution, ideally that would be within the compass of a company, after incorporation. But that's maybe a very boring document when you look at it in its sort of black and white on the paper, but it's often the solution to an awful lot of headaches and the way of actually dealing with a lot of people who've invested a lot of energy as volunteers in an organisation and become very, very enthusiastic, but also very charged. It's a good way of diffusing a situation and helping to take matters forward. And as somebody who, like Tom, spends a lot of time sorting out people's problems when things have gone wrong, I think the thing I'd emphasise is that the time and investment in getting these sorts of things right up front is well worth it. There is certainly where it's a volunteer organisation. There is nothing more sapping of time and money and morale than actually having to deal with matters that might turn into a piece of litigation in court, but certainly require sorting out and professional advice and assistance. But certainly when they become litigation, a claim in court, it's a very, very time-consuming and distracting thing. So the time and investment and attention to these sorts of issues we're talking about up front is time very well spent. Tom.
I think we're actually going to go to Alex now to talk about some of the case studies that we have.
Thanks very much, Tom. So I'm just going to go through a bit of experience that myself and Dave have had, as the RFU, about when it starts to go wrong. And just to reiterate some points that Tina and James have made, sort of rugby clubs are no different to what they've been speaking about, that they're not proactive with reviewing and updating their governance. And generally, governance only comes on the agenda when something goes wrong and it all blows up. And this is when the bleating starts, and disputes start. But whatever happens is they really do leave a lasting effect. And going on to the next slide, sort of like, the paperwork that builds up on these disputes. So, one example, I went to a rugby club to help them with their incorporation and to get them through so they could get a long-term lease. And all of a sudden, on my way out, I had a chat in the car park, and I thought it was to do with the incorporation. So I said I'd have a chat with this person, but it turned out it was nothing to do with the incorporation. And it was actually a challenge and disciplinary dispute from years before. And since then, it continues to go on, but we've received over 400 pages of documentation. And this dispute has been going on for over 8 years, and it's really consumed the individuals that are involved, very energy sapping. But it all started from poor disciplinary processes at the start. And if it was followed in a good process, as James was saying, and stuff, then it could have all been avoided. And what we do find is, and we've got 2 cases just very recently, in the last few weeks, that both clubs, because of disputes, are lost senior committee members who resigned as a result of a poor constitution that's allowed issues to continue at the club. And another one that I've just experienced just last week, speaking to a club where the touch team has left to go to another club. And the key reason was they had no voting rights and no voice at the club, and they weren't really part of the governance sort of structure. And the results of these things and the bad governance results in clubs being split and valuable people leaving the club. And as James was saying, getting it right at the start, doing it once and doing it right, can save this money down the drain. The money's being spent to sort out governance challenges that we sort of see there, and certainly as well getting that financial policies and procedures in place. We have seen loads of clubs have fraudulent activities actually happen at their clubs. So one club, for instance, that I dealt with actually lost £30,000 through their treasurer, who obviously was in financial difficulty. The interesting thing was, at £20,000 they'd spotted it and they said, as long as you put it back, we'll let you off. But obviously they're in financial trouble, so then they started to take a bit more money, and in the end it was £30,000 and the police got involved and things. The funny thing is, I chatted with the club after this case and said, okay, so have we got dual signatories in place for the club? And they said, no, we trust this one. Hasten to say, after my conversation, that dual signatories are now in place at that club to put some things in place. And finally, just put out there, we do get clubs on the sort of next slide that have disciplinary disputes that end up in legal action, and all these things that come to happen with the expense, the time, the energy and the emotions that go into this. And we've also seen employment disputes, not in England, but one case, a club steward was got rid of by a Welsh club, and they were unincorporated, and went to employment tribunal, and they were going after the treasurer who got rid of the club stewards for £60,000, and because they were unincorporated and didn't really have the right sort of legal structure in place, that was going to be on the treasurer's house to find that £60,000. And the final thing I just want to leave you with, just to sort of put, to get this sort of proactive, we spoke with our head of discipline at the RFU that we were running this webinar this evening, and he sort of gave me a message, that he sort of really wants to put out. And he said, I want to stress that the money and time spent on getting a strong constitution and robust disciplinary process in place will save everyone a lot of time and money in the long term. I have many examples where clubs have not followed process, and this has led to ongoing issues within the club that often last for years. As a result, the club splits and valuable people leave the club. And I just want to leave you with that message, sort of like, so it's great that you're here and you're taking a proactive approach for your governance, and I'm going to pass you back to Tina about what is good governance.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alex. That's great. I thought I'd first of all just explain what we actually mean by some of the terminology we've used. Start off with constitution. This is really your governing document. It's the document which governs your club. It could be just a simple set of rules if you're unincorporated, and if you're incorporated, it'll be your statutory documents. But that sets out what your club is. Under that constitution, you're going to have policies. As Alex has talked about, it's really important to have proper policies in place which deal with a number of different issues, so you know what to do and just avoid those problems when they do arise. And procedures. Again, you need to follow process if something happens. Often people complain that they spend their time writing these procedures, but write them. They'll then only ever get used if a problem occurs. But you do need to have those procedures in place. If you don't have them in place, you'll be not only floundering, but you're losing money and time and effort, and you might lose a court case. But governance is really more than about the documentation. It's really about the values of the club and making sure you live and breathe those values. And those should be documented, but you need to monitor that you are actually really bringing those forward, and they go through every vein of the club. And that goes on into principles as well, and leadership and direction of the club. So it's not all about the paperwork, it's actually what you do. And it's not just completing the documentation, you have to ensure that you comply with it and you follow those processes. So I'm now going to move on to what is the principles of good governance. There are loads of really good guides out there, whether you look at Sport England, when you look at the RFU's own website, or Charity Commission, they have really good definitions of what is good governance. And it's difficult to make a very general statement as to what we consider good governance, because it does depend on the type of organisation. But there are a few principles that we can draw out. The first is purpose. And again, that seems really obvious, but you must set out in your constitution what is the purpose of your club. Is it going to have a geographical remit? Is it going to cover all types of sport, age groups? Are you going to have a youth group? Are you going to be doing coaching? So just set out what your purpose is, because it's quite amazing how often we see disputes occur when people have different ideas about what the main purpose of the club is. The next is leadership. And again, we do find, particularly within unincorporated associations, some really difficult thinking, again, because everybody wants to get involved and everybody's doing it on a voluntary basis. But you have to have a really clear leadership. If you're incorporated, obviously that's going to be your board, and it's very clear as to where responsibility lies. But with an unincorporated association, you need some governing committee or management committee that's going to have effective powers, and they're going to be responsible for the strategy, the leadership, and the direction of the club. And that leadership has to take collective responsibility. You can't just let your chairman make all the decisions. It's really important that everybody is responsible for those decisions. And equally, you can't just delegate responsibility down to subcommittees or individuals or even paid staff. It's the responsibility of the governing or management committee or the board to take those decisions, and they are ultimately responsible for the club. And you must always remember that. It does become more complicated when you have a paid executive. So if you have a chief executive officer, there's obviously a relationship between the governing board and that paid executive or that paid member of staff. But ultimately, the board is the committee or the board of directors that's going to take responsibility. And one of its chief roles is to appoint and supervise a chief executive. The effectiveness of the leadership has to be constantly reviewed. This means actually making sure you have a good range of skills on your leadership board and that they are effective. And that might mean that you have to look at your ways of appointing, whether it's through elections through the membership, or some boards of governors, it'll actually be the directors themselves which will make further appointments. And to look to see whether you have to bring people in from outside the membership as well, in order to make sure you have the right skill range. And you may look at codes of practice, which some of the larger clubs will do to make sure that your trustees, your board members, your committee members are all acting appropriately. Decision making is something we're asked about quite a bit. And decision-making procedures must be very clear, and they should be set out in your constitutional documents, whether you're voting on matters by majority, how you call meetings, how they're minuted, and what information has to be made available. And it must be really clear in your constitution as to what matters have to get referred back to your membership and what matters that your general committee or your board can make. And again, there's often a lack of clarity, which can lead to awful problems, particularly if a club is looking to move its site, perhaps take on a smaller club. All of those things, you need to ensure that you have real clarity as to how your decision making is made. If you are delegating to subcommittees, having terms of reference and having reporting back to your board and your governing committee is important. Again, often there is responsibility delegated, and they assume that that delegated responsibility means that they've devolved all responsibility and authority. But that's not the case. Responsibility still sits with the main board or governing committee. So we must be very clear in all places as to what responsibilities are. Openness, integrity, and accountability is very clear as to what that should involve. But that really, with a club, is absolutely at the heart of what you do. There's clearly going to be matters which are going to have to be dealt with confidentially, and your structure and your constitution should make that very clear. But the general default position is that what you're doing has to be fully open and there has to be accountability. And that you have to ensure that you have ability to have whistleblowing, people can bring issues to the main board, and there are proper processes that you can follow. The good governance must also embrace risk and control. I'm sure a lot of you actually have risk registers. You actually look at what your main risks are and how you actually control those risks, whether through insurance or whether through other means. But being aware of where your risk, where the risks are to your club is vital, and then having a method of managing. That may be that you accept some risks, and that's perfectly valid. You can make that decision to do so. But in other cases, you may feel that the decision making has to be aware of the fact that you're moving into an area which could destroy the assets of the club, and you shouldn't be taking those risks. We also always recommend that you adopt appropriate policies and procedures for risk and control. And at this point, I'm just going to hand back to James again, who's going to talk about some of the types of policies and procedures that you might like to adopt or consider, which will help you run your club. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Tina. I mean, just picking up on where you left off, I think in addressing all of this, if you're thinking about risk and control, then I think that the starting point is very definitely insurance. And just having a conversation, with Dave and with Alex before we went live on this, I sort of said, well, how does it work? And as I understand it, through either club or individual membership of the RFU, you get an awful lot laid on a plate in terms of insurance, with Howdens as the brokers. And I think that's absolutely great. I mean, and would that all sports were set up as well as that. But I think the importance with insurance is making sure that actually you don't just take it as a given, that it is there as a sort of simple sort of catch-all, and that every last thing you're doing will automatically be covered just because there is an insurance policy that kicks in with membership. I mean, it's very much a prudent thing to do, but I mean, also part of your duties as trustees, directors, to actually think about, have we got enough insurance cover, both in terms of the amount of cover, but actually have we started doing something new which we haven't actually notified to the insurance brokers, or are we doing something which might not actually be covered by the package of policies that you get as members of the RFU? And I think that's it's a good opportunity to do that sort of review, and then to actually pick up the phone to the brokers and have an intelligent conversation about that. And just to make the point, I mean, Tom said in the introduction that one of the things I do in my spare time is effectively a DIY, taking a pilgrimage every year to Lourdes in the southwest of France. And that's an odd exercise. It's a DIY care home in a foreign country, with about 250 people, of whom perhaps 60 are in wheelchairs and have disabilities. And that's taught me very, very in a very clear way to think about where the gaps between insurance might be. That's a very non-standard thing to try and insure. You've got to map out what the component bits of travel and people's health and care and liabilities, and indeed in a foreign country there, what they are. And it's important to address that, because you can go on to the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the incorporation, which is something we would recommend, and I know the RFU would recommend and does recommend to you very strongly. But if you haven't got the insurance, it's not going to offer entire protection. And I think coming on to that limitation of liability, I mean, you heard from Alex about the treasurer of the Welsh club. If there isn't a company structure there, and if there is a claim, an insurance claim, an uninsured personal injury claim from something that might have happened on the field, then it's primarily the officers of the trustees of the club who are in the firing line. But I mean, Tom may have some more up-to-date case law, but the last time I looked, it wasn't a terribly clear position actually as to whether, if the officers' assets that could be brought to satisfy any claim were not enough, that you couldn't actually see the lawyers going after the members as well. So it's a very unsatisfactory state of affairs where you're taking knowing risks as you are, given the nature of the activity. So we would strongly recommend thinking, if you're not already incorporated, about a company structure. And I think the other thing from the point of view of limitation, and this sort of brings us on to policy and procedure, is that look at the terms on which people join the club and do the club's activities. You can't exclude in law death or liability for death or personal injury through negligence, but so far as it's reasonable, you can exclude liability for other things, and you can point out to people that they're taking knowing risks, so that actually if you had to answer a claim, you'd be able to say, well, there was contribution towards the to the risk. This person ran the risk on a knowing basis. It's quite important to have those sorts of things in mind too. I'm not going to dive deep into all of the different sorts of policies that you've got on the screen in front of you, but I think what's quite important is twofold. There is a bit in this day and age of the cosmetic about having policies and procedures, and that's not making a sort of cheap point, but actually there will be an expectation, on a very superficial basis to start off with, that you've actually got these in place, because it is the expectation of these days. But I think in terms of the substance, it's these are not unnecessary millstones around your neck to make the running of clubs a more boring thing. And they are there to protect people who are the participants in, but also to protect the club, its assets, its officers. I think you've got to take a reasonable approach to this. I came into charity trusteeship, for example, for one of those charities that Tom mentioned at the start, and had a look at the array of about 25 policies. And I thought, well, data protection policy, and there's a privacy policy, and then there's a separate data protection policy where it relates to disclosure and barring, DBS checking. And I thought, well, why don't we combine these into one policy, make it more workable? And I've in 3 years on that, I've been quite consistent on that. But actually, the way to handle policies is that they should be proportionate and they should be according to need. But particularly if you are largely volunteer run, then set a date in the calendar annually where they're all reviewed. Make sure they're not, as we've found, very practical experience, we were finding half of each committee meeting, each board meeting was taken up reviewing another policy. Try and make them reviewable on an annual basis. Give somebody, a board member, a trustee, a responsibility to own that policy, so that actually they review it. They come to the board meeting every year, if it doesn't have to be looked at sooner, and they say, well, we've learnt certain things, or perhaps we've had to go and get a bit of external advice, and we're recommending improvements and things to actually better protect our position. But give ownership of those policies. I think that's absolutely key. I think the other thing, really, in the same vein, and that's about protection, is think carefully about the next time that you have a director or a trustee retiring, and you're looking to a new appointment. Think about the sort of spread of skills, and this goes particularly where you're a largely voluntary body. It never happens like this in reality, but in an ideal world, you have someone who is a good secretary, who's very willing to take the minutes and actually record things and then chivvy people about action points and things like that. You will have a treasurer who is good and has sort of accountancy skills or bookkeeping skills. You might want to try and get a lawyer on board. You might, given the nature of the physical risks, if you can find somebody who's a doctor who's involved, or a nurse, that might be an addition. Think about the breadth of skills that actually would make up the ideal board, and then as time goes on, try to recruit from people who have those skill sets if they're available. That can make a real difference in terms of not just good governance, but also in terms of mitigating and limiting risk and liability. I think on that note, I'll hand back to Tom.
Thank you, James. Yeah, so sporting organisations and clubs are by no means unique when it comes to a need for good governance. But because of the way clubs and associations are typically structured at the amateur and the grassroots level, and also to some extent also at the elite level, and because most sports take place under the oversight or under the umbrella of a national or an international governing body, there are additional issues that need to be borne in mind for sports clubs. And this is what I've referred to in the middle of this slide as the specificity of sport. It's the governance issues that apply almost uniquely in a sporting environment. And whilst we haven't got time this evening to get into the detail of what it is that makes sports clubs and sports organisations unique, we'll have a look at some of the unique resources that are available to sports clubs to help with good governance and to help you make sure that your governance is fit for purpose, not just now, but moving forward, as Tina said right at the beginning, as clubs grow and as clubs develop. So for a typical sports club, the governance landscape is going to consist of a few different layers, if you like. So at the heart of it, you're going to have the applicable legal obligations that apply to organisations across the country. So the obvious examples might be the Companies Act, the Trustee Act, and the Charities Act, for example. These are the laws that apply to all companies, all organisations in the UK, depending on what it is they're doing. So the specific law that applies will always depend on a number of different factors. It could be dependent on the type of organisation concerned. Is it a company limited by shares, a company limited by a guarantee, or even an unincorporated association, for example? But beyond that, the applicable law is also going to depend on the type of activity that's being carried on by the organisation. So, for example, data protection laws might apply to clubs that process personal data, whereas they might not apply to clubs if they're not keeping any personal data or if they're not processing the personal data. And then you have, for example, the Finance Act, which might apply to clubs that are revenue or profit generating, whereas that won't apply to clubs that aren't generating any revenue or profits. Then, in terms of the next layer, you then have the club's governing body, whether that's national or international. So we're talking about England Rugby or World Rugby in this particular case. The governing body may impose additional regulatory requirements when it comes to the governance of your club, and we'll look at in a moment at the RFU guidance on this. And then lastly, you have the requirements of organisations that provide financial support to sporting organisations, regardless of the level, all the way through from grassroots right through to elite sport. And I think that's probably quite a good place to start when we're looking at the specifics of sport. And the Sport England, a Code for Good Governance, is a really useful resource for helping organisations to improve their governance structure. So the code applies to any organisation that's seeking government or national lottery funding. So it might not apply to your club at this stage or at all. But if you're thinking about governance, and the chances are that you are because you're listening to our webinar, the code is a really great resource to turn to. Now, it focuses on three particular areas. That's transparency, accountability, and financial integrity. And if you skip back a few slides to the points that Tina was making, they're the sorts of things that we're looking at when we refer to the umbrella term of governance or good governance. Now, the code in fact acknowledges that it really does just reflect good practice, but where appropriate and where necessary, it also reflects the specifics of sport. The other thing that I like about the code is that it's tiered. So if you're actually having to comply with the code, basically the more funding that you're after, the higher the standards that you have to achieve. So rugby clubs can use the code as a guide, and they can opt for an approach which is proportionate to the size or the purpose of the club, and also proportionate to or applicable to the funding requirement that you might be after. So at the bottom, you have Tier 1, which is really just aimed at community sports clubs, and all the way through to Tier 3, which will apply to organisations seeking high value, very long-term investments, which might actually include governing bodies themselves. When you get into the detail of the code, it's based around 5 specific principles, and then within each principle you have a number of requirements. So it's this step-by-step approach, which is a really easy way of understanding the components that make up a good governance structure. So the principles in the code are structure, people, communication, standards and conduct, and policies and processes. And we've talked about those already this evening. I was going to go into a little bit of detail around some of the principles, but I think we probably don't quite have time for that, but we can pick that up afterwards if anybody is interested. So whilst the code isn't necessarily binding on rugby clubs, and many of you may not have looked at it in the past, if you're wanting to understand what good governance looks like in a general sporting environment, it's an excellent starting place. It also has resources that complement those which are actually published by the RFU. So when it comes to the RFU, you have again some excellent resource available to you. The starting point for governance is the RFU Governance Health Check, and it's a comprehensive suite of checks to ensure that clubs achieve a robust governance structure. The checks aim to help organisations spot any deficiencies with the club's structure. So it could be with the governance itself, or even the individual's understanding of what actually amounts to good governance and what good governance actually looks like. I think we've got a link on our final slide to the RFU Governance Health Check. But again, broadly, they cover the health checks available cover legal status, constitution and values, committee structure and succession planning, finance and procedures, and are you ready for funding? So all the sorts of things that we've talked about this evening, and when it comes to funding, the things that the Sport England Code looks at specifically. There's also the Irwin Mitchell Legal and Tax Helpline. I mention this as it's a helpline that you can call. I think all members of the RFU have access to it. But you can call with queries relating to governance and the topics we've discussed this evening, as well as any other legal or tax questions that you might be grappling with. And there are trained individuals that can help you answer those questions. And then lastly, there's the RFU Legal Portal. Now, this doesn't necessarily focus only on governance, but it's a further suite of documentation and precedent documents that can be used by clubs to meet the legal and regulatory requirements we've been talking about tonight. So it can be slightly overwhelming, I think, if you're starting from scratch, or if you think you need to start from scratch with your governance structure. But I think the real point of this slide is to let you know that there is help out there. And one of the great things about sport is that it's really well organised from the top down, and there is an awful lot of resource that just doesn't exist in other industries. I think now I'm going to pass on to Tina. We've been talking about, in passing, the various legal structures that are available or typically used for sports clubs, but Tina's going to take you through some of those structures in more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know that the RFU is running a workshop and actually run the same workshop quite regularly. So book your place now, understanding legal structures. But all I'm going to do is just perhaps emphasise the importance of getting your structure right to good governance. And in fact, if you get your legal structure right, it helps a great deal. And if you move towards a statutory framework, there's a lot of protection and there's a lot of help, whether it's under the Companies Act, whether it's a charity or any other form of incorporated body that assists you. And please don't be afraid. I've certainly been on an unincorporated charity and we went through the process, and I'm sorry to say I'm one of those people that although I knew I should do it, we never did it. And the trustee body was 2 lawyers, 2 accountants, and we were unincorporated until suddenly we had to do it. We were about to sign a big document with another organisation. We were forced to do it, and we had to do it in a real hurry, and it cost us a lot more money than it should have done. But we got there in the end. And we hear so often, well, it's always worked all right in the past, why do it? It's just going to be money for everyone else, a lot of fuss. We never had any problems. Why change our constitution? Why change our structure? It's that sort of attitude that will get you into problems, because you don't know you need it until you have a problem, as everyone has been saying today. And these problems come up from anywhere, and not because your club is necessarily badly run, but they can emerge. So the structure is really important because it sets out whether you're actually a legal entity, and we've talked a bit about incorporation. Really importantly, it impacts on members' liability, and anyone here that's a board of directors or a member of a general committee of an unincorporated association will know that is so important when you're looking at signing contracts. It certainly has financial implications, whether you can get funds, but the type of legal structure will impose on you, just by its nature, different rules and requirements. And quite a lot of them are good disciplines. Others may be greater administration, but the benefit that you get through actually adopting a good, solid, dependable structure will more than outweigh the cost and time that you have to incur in order to get there. Many banks and indeed other stakeholders, local authorities, as well as Sport England, will look at your constitution and will encourage you to go towards an incorporated structure. So I'm just going to move on from that really quickly. As I say, we've talked a lot about incorporation and limited liability, and being lawyers, we're on limiting liability. And the key differences are set out in that slide, and I won't go through them in a great deal of detail, but it's just to say that if you are an unincorporated association, you're just bound by a set of rules, and individuals that are entering into contracts are going to be personally liable on those contracts. You may have some contractual limitation, but you're also going to be liable for negligence and other issues relating to the club. And one of the things, being a property lawyer, that constantly occurs is that your property has to be held by trustees. Now, the trustees really don't have any other function except for holding the assets and holding the property. And I certainly had one sailing club where the 3 trustees had all died. We couldn't find their personal representatives. It took months and months, if not years, to actually reconstitute, only because we were trying to renew a lease, and because the original trustees of the property had sadly died. So that's a really good reason, if nothing else, to move to an incorporated structure. Just moving on from that, the next issue you have to think of is, do you have charity status? And that brings with it its own administration. Charity status is not a legal structure, and it's a sort of common mistake that's made. Clubs can have the additional status of a charity. One of the purposes of a charity is provision of amateur sports, so you're perfectly entitled to go for that. It brings loads of benefits, mostly tax benefits and business rates, and perhaps gives you some exposure to other funds and grant-making charities, but it obviously brings its own administration. There's the alternative of a community interest company, which in itself, because it's formed for the purpose of the community, can't be a charity. And any club where you're actually producing profits which are going to be distributed also can't be a charity. I'm not going to say anything about community amateur sports club schemes because I really don't think they're used a great deal, but that's an alternative means of registration. So moving swiftly on, I thought I'd just highlight the different types of incorporation. Now, some of these will be well known to you, and you'll probably come across them in other walks of life. But the most familiar for any club is a company limited by guarantee. Now, this is a form of company that's registered at Companies House, but you don't have shareholders, you have members who all subscribe by guarantee, normally just £1. It is the most flexible, not-for-profit organisation for clubs to adopt. And you'll find there are many precedents which set out the form of articles of association that you will need. It's an easy incorporation to use. Yes, you have to comply with the Companies Act, but it's not onerous at all. The second is the very familiar company limited by shares, again registered to Companies House. You may want to use this type of structure where you have a owner that actually is expecting a profit out of the company. But it's unusual for amateur and voluntary sports clubs, and you should try and stick to a company limited by guarantee. A community interest company is yet another form of company which is registered at Companies House, and it has a particular purpose and has particular restrictions, primarily an asset lock. It's mutually exclusive of a charity, and a few sports clubs are registered as community interest companies. It has a few benefits. And I've certainly seen clubs adopting this type of incorporation. The disadvantage is that it doesn't have the same tax benefits that a charity has, but at the same time you have all the additional company requirements. But it has some very clear benefits as well, because you are demonstrating to the community that you're formed for their purpose, and certainly local authorities support them and like them a great deal. There's the old-fashioned where friendly societies, and there's also the charity incorporated organisation, which is a different form of charity, which can be used. But as I say, the normal structure is company limited by guarantee. It's not difficult. The RFU, I know, can take you through the process, so don't be scared of doing that. And just to summarise where you might be on an unincorporated association, I've split it into two, although very few sporting clubs tend to be charitable trusts these days. There are a few clubs which are really lucky, have got old charitable endowments, or their perhaps their grounds are given to them on endowments, and they're still charitable trusts, and they're actually governed by a trust deed and registered with the Charity Commission. But it's not a route that we would necessarily recommend. It's easier to go as a limited company and register as a charity that way. The normal type of legal structure that we see when clubs start is the straightforward unincorporated association. Again, you can register as a charity, but it's just a group of individuals bound by a set of rules, which they call the Constitution. And it tends to be that type of structure where we see problems occurring, because they've outgrown that type of structure, and they're exposing their officers to risk, and indeed they're going to find it difficult to grow and move forward. So that was a really quick skip through the types of legal structure, but I would really recommend that you join the RFU's own workshop on legal structures, because I think it would help you a great deal. I'd like to move on at this point. I think we're going back to Tom.
I think so, Tina. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to look at the specific duties of trustees and directors. I've just been told we've got 2 minutes in which to do so, so it will be a bit of a rattle through. But we're frequently asked about the specific duties that are owed by trustees and directors. So we just thought we'd look at some of the obligations that are owed if you are appointed to one of those positions. So the duties are really summarised on this slide. So for trustees, they must always observe the terms of the trust. Effectively, you have to follow the rules. They have to act impartially as between the beneficiaries of the trust. So you can't prefer the interests of one beneficiary to those of another. The trustee must always act or exercise reasonable care, and a trustee mustn't make an unauthorised profit from the trust or from the trust assets. The trustees have to act personally and not to delegate without authority or permission to do so. And I think that's the point that Tina was making right at the beginning of the seminar, is that responsibility for decisions always that rests ultimately with the directors or with the trustees. Trustees need to keep the trust information confidential. And finally, the trustees need to adhere or be aware of the duty to disclose key information and documentation to the beneficiaries of the trust, and that's a key sort of transparency point that's very important. So for directors, many of the duties are the same, and that's just the way that the law has developed over many hundreds of years. But for directors, they must only exercise their powers properly and for the specific purposes those powers have been conferred for. So that will usually be by reference to the company's articles of association or the other constitutional documents that your club has in place. Directors must always promote the success of the company. They have to exercise independent judgment, and they mustn't let their judgment or their discretion become fettered. Directors have to act with reasonable skill, care and diligence. And this is a point that comes up time and time again, actually. So if I've got time, I'll just touch on that in a bit more detail at the end. Directors also have to avoid conflicts of interests. And finally, directors also owe a number of fiduciary duties. The fiduciary duties are similar to those set out above, but broadly to act in the company's best interests, to avoid conflicts, and to maintain confidence in the company's confidential information. So there are a number of other ways that a director or an individual involved with a sports club can become personally liable, but by breaching these duties, the director or the trustee is really exposing themselves to a potential claim. As I say, some of the common ones are where the director, or some of the common breaches are where the director has failed to discharge the duty to promote the success of the company. So in doing so, directors are, when acting in the company's best interests, directors have to have regard to a number of factors, which include the long-term success of the company, and sometimes this might contrast with the desire to generate short-term returns for shareholders if your company is a company limited by share. You have to have regard to the company's employees, the suppliers and the stakeholders, and the need to maintain a reputation for good business conduct. Now this goes back again to a point that was raised right at the beginning, but in order to promote the success of the club or the company, the director really does need to first understand as a kind of a foundational principle what success actually means to the club. Is it improved financial performance, a larger and more diverse membership base, for example, or is it improved on-field performance? It could be any one of those or any particular purpose, but only once the aim of the club has actually been established can a director more easily consider and justify the decisions that they take. And then, so I think probably just to wrap up, sometimes promoting the success of the company will contradict what may be in the director's own personal interests. And where there is a conflict of interest like that, the director needs to have regard to the duty to avoid a conflict of interest. And practically what that normally means, and it will depend on the company's incorporation documents as to how conflicts are actually dealt with. But ordinarily, that means that the director will be obliged to disclose the conflict and the nature of it, and then to excuse themselves from any decision made in relation to the transaction in question. And that way, the director cannot be accused of acting where there is a conflict or of preferring their own interests to those of the company. So I think on that note, we can probably wrap up and move along to the Q&A. I think to recap what we've talked about, the key points are to pick the right legal structure for your club, review and update not only the structure but the policies and procedure that you have in place, and use all of the resources that we've hopefully pointed you or signposted you in the direction of this evening, and follow those guides, not always to the letter, but certainly the principle, so that you actually have a really strong code at a club and your governance is good. And for all the reasons that Tina and James outlined at the beginning of this session, that will hopefully make your club a much stronger and much more robust organisation. Dave, can I hand on to you to host the Q&A if we have time?
Yeah, I think we've got just a couple of minutes, but actually there's a couple of questions. So let me start off with one to the panel, which came in from Peter. He basically says, we are hoping to move from an organisation that is a rugby club, so I'm assuming that they're a standalone rugby club, to one which is a multi-sport club run by and from the rugby club. What would be the main challenges in governance and what could be the pitfalls? Who wants to pick that one up?
Well, I think it goes back to that partly back to that very last slide. Actually, is actually understanding what the purpose is going to be and having a clear and defined purpose for the club, and that will then set the framework for what the club's management is actually intending to achieve. I don't think there's any particular problem with having a club which is formed of lots of different sports, but it's just about understanding what the primary purpose of the club is going to be.
And therefore how all those separate parts mesh together to form something that's stronger than the current. Is that, yeah. Okay, brilliant. Okay, I think there was one that came in at the end. Let me just get down. Yeah, Nick from Wimborne. What is the difference between a director of a company limited by guarantee and an officer/committee member of a club that is incorporated as under the community cooperative and community benefit society?
Sorry, do you want me to pick that one up?
Yes, please.
Yes, they're very similar duties, and I would just refer back to what Tom has said. They are both officers of the body, and therefore they assume very similar duties. So I think you can take it that any duty or responsibility which a director takes on, an officer of the CIC would take on as well. So there's very little difference.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That would be my understanding, but it's a good question because obviously you call them directors under the company limited by guarantees. But okay. Finally, hang on. Let me just see if there's anything else that's come in right at the end. No. Finally, one which isn't a question as such, but it was a statement, and I did ask for a bit more information. Richard knows who he is. Where does vicarious liability fit into this piece around good governance, and what's the issues there in terms of a club? Again, I don't mind who picks that one up.
Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. The principle of vicarious liability is where the club or the company is liable for the actions of its servants. So the typical example would be where the club is liable for the actions taken by an employee or somebody else appointed on behalf of the club to carry out functions. The important thing here is to make sure that your policies are appropriately drafted, and that your employment contracts or the documents that give the employee or whatever the volunteer, if you like, whatever gives them the power to carry on the functions on behalf of the club needs to be clear, so that you can determine if that employee, for example, does something which incurs a liability to a third party, that third party might try and come after the club for that person's actions. And the way to defend those sorts of actions or those claims is to be able to demonstrate that the employee or the agent was acting well outside of the powers that were conferred on them. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of a good example, but unfortunately,
I can give you one, which is just people on the call probably know this, is that where you might have a paid player who commits an act of violence on the pitch because he's an employee, therefore it's there, and we've seen cases of that. So it was just in the thing. I think you've answered it quite well, though. Thank you for that. Yeah.
So on that example, David, I think you'd be saying that the club isn't vicariously liable for the actions of the player, because those actions, the aggressive behaviour or the fighting, falls so far outside of what is expected of that employee, that paid player, that the club can in no way be responsible for that. Whereas conversely, to kind of set that off, you might have, for example, a cleaner employed by the club that leaves I don't know, a mop and a bucket outside of the clubhouse. Somebody comes along and trips over the bucket, and they might say that actually the club is vicariously liable for cleaner's actions in leaving the prop there, if you like. And in that case, it would be quite hard to say, well, the cleaner should never have done that, because actually, that's the sort of behaviour that falls quite squarely within the role. So I think that's one way of illustrating it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I've just got one point, which is there is a question in there which I've answered in the chat, which I'll deal with now, is around community amateur sports clubs. Obviously, we have a number of those in our sport and across all sports. On its own, it does not provide incorporation or any other limited liability. It is purely a tax vehicle, so it gives you some financial benefits. And as I think Tina mentioned throughout the presentation, we do run quite regularly, Alex and I, understanding your legal structure, and we do include in that stuff around cask and charity. So my suggestion would be to either come back to me or Alex direct, or to hook into that to get a better understanding. Anyway, we're a little bit over time, I think, but that's good. It's 8:05, and I'd like to say thank you ever so much to Irwin Mitchell and Tom, Tina, and James, I think it is this evening, who've taken us through this webinar. Very, very interesting. Some of it very thought-provoking. And I hope you have a good rest of the evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon on the next webinar that we run. Thank you very much.